you. So, how many people here are philanthropists in their view? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people here are advisors to philanthropists? How many people think that the people you advise would be better served if they listened to you? Okay. How many people want to be philanthropists? Everybody. Okay. So I have the good fortune to be in an economic situation. I've become a philanthropist in recent years, and I just wanted to talk briefly this morning about three things that you can remember because all of them begin with the letter I. The first is intellect. I'd like you to all think about this. The Earth itself is about 5 billion years old. 5 billion years old. Life itself started on the Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. Tiny cells. Humans, what we are, our predecessors, Neanderthals and so forth, surfaced on the Earth about 1 million years ago. Homo sapiens about, you could say, 200 to 300,000 years ago. When the Homo sapiens began coming out of caves and doing the things they did to stay alive, and they were just worried about staying alive, subsistence and so forth, shelter, it wasn't probably apparent till all the other species on the face of the Earth, there are 10 million species now, there might have been 20 million species then, we don't know. It wasn't apparent that humans would, and Homo sapiens, dominate the Earth for the good or bad. It wasn't apparent because we weren't as big as elephants, we weren't as fast as tigers, we weren't as able to resist, let's say, bad weather as other animals, but something clicked and it made the humans be able to take over the world, for better or worse. Now, what was it? Well, it was the most amazing single device creation that ever has existed on the face of the Earth. Whether it came about through God or evolution, I'll let other people decide, but that was the human brain. The human brain is something that no other species on the face of the Earth obviously had a device, anything like this. And what the brain was able to do in humans is to develop a culture. It was able to learn how to speak so other people could understand, but presumably some animals that are not humans could do that as well in a different language that we don't understand. But we were also able as humans to create art and a culture that was passed down from generation to generation. We saw recently that the Neanderthals actually were the people who put art on caves in Spain 60,000 years ago, and we're still looking at that art. And it turned out that over centuries and millennia, as humans evolved, the ability to express themselves through art, written language, oral language, dance, music, whatever it might be, exceeded anything that anybody might have imagined when humans first came out of caves. And so when you think about it, the ability of humans to create culture, which passes down from generation to generation to generation, is probably the most inspiring thing that you can think about, because the human brain that all of us have has enabled us to develop a culture which today enables us to see the greatest minds in the world, what they've created 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 10 years ago, today, and be able to think about what they have done that made life worth living, because we can see so many wonderful works of art and culture and music and so forth. So the first thing I just would remind people about is that we're all blessed with a brain that is something that nobody else, no other species on the face of the Earth has, and it's enabled us to create a culture which is something all of us as humans should take pride in what we've achieved over thousands of years and be able to do the kinds of things that we've done with this brain. The second I is inspiration. When people see what people have done in works of music or art, literature, sculpture, tapestry, photography, whatever it might be, it inspires people to try to do something even better. So no artist comes along and says, I'm going to create something from whole cloth without any inspiration from what happened before. Everybody is looking towards what happened before and to see if they can improve it. Now, we're very fortunate, to some extent, that humans, for the last thousands of years, have recognized that to inspire people to create great things, you have to preserve things. George Santayana, a famous Harvard historian, once said, those who don't remember history are condemned to relive it. But he might have said, or others might have said, those that don't preserve culture are unlikely to be able to improve upon culture. So fortunately, our forebears throughout the world have tried the best they can to preserve culture through written form, through artwork, through all kinds of things, and so that people who are in our generation can be inspired by people before us, what they did. And they can do that by going to museums and seeing this culture, by going to theater, by going to other performing arts kinds of institutions, by going to a whole variety of things where you can see what other people did. The inspiration that is so necessary to create great works of art and great culture and to make culture better than what it was before is what's necessary. And to do that, you need to preserve what you already have. The third thing I want you to think about that begins with an I is impact. We are in the United States the most philanthropic country in the world by far, in the history of the world. And the reason for that is that historically, other countries had large governments that funded everything. So in Europe, the governments or the churches dominated the countries, and so when they needed works of art, they needed all kinds of things done in education, libraries, and so forth, that was funded by the government. When this country was started, we had no money. We had no big government. We'd have no big churches with money. And so the early settlers in this country, they had to, if they wanted to do something, they had to create volunteer associations, as they called them. They had to create ways of people contributing to something to happen. So when Benjamin Franklin wanted to create a library, he had to get other people to contribute to it. When settlers wanted to have, or colonialists wanted to have universities, they didn't have the government to give them the money for it, so initially they created it privately. And that tradition of volunteerism or association or philanthropy is a tradition that was denoted by de Tocqueville. When he came here in the 1800s, he wrote, everybody in the United States seems to be doing volunteering. They're all volunteering. We've never seen anything like this in Europe. And that's because people here had to do this if we're going to have great culture passed down from one generation to the next. It was necessary. There was no government that could fund it. And so the tradition of philanthropy began in this country a long time ago, and it still exists today. Roughly 2.3% of GDP in the United States is given every year to philanthropic organizations. And that is the highest in the world by far. Nobody is even close. That's still a relatively small amount of money compared to what governments spend each year on solving social problems, but still, it's the largest in the world. Of that amount of money, that 2.3% or so that's given every year to philanthropy, a very, very small part goes to art and culture, a very, very small part. Now, why is that? Well, it's generally the view that perhaps preserving art and culture, inspiring people to see art and culture isn't as important as saving lives, which is obviously very important, or religious purposes, which are very important as well. So the largest amount of money every year that's given philanthropically is given to religious purposes, roughly somewhere between 30 and 35% of all philanthropic donations in the United States each year are given to religious organizations, a very good cause and so forth. Probably 15 or 20% is given to education, and maybe 15 or so percent to medical research and social services. A very small percentage is given to the arts and culture, just 4%. And so the word impact is a word that I think about when I think about arts and culture, because you can have so much greater impact with your philanthropic dollars in the arts world and the culture world, preserving arts, enhancing arts, and preserving culture, because so few people are doing it, relatively speaking. And this was struck to me, and a thing that happened to me that happened by serendipity, completely serendipity. As I made a fair amount of money and got to be very lucky, I came, like Darren, from a very modest background. My parents didn't have any money. Father was not educated, didn't go to college or high school. My parents, my father worked in the post office. He made a very, very small salary. And so I didn't really have any money. And when I got lucky and had some money, if having money is luck, that's a debatable proposition, because many people who have money are very unhappy, but I'm pretty happy. So I would say that when I got money, I said, okay, what am I going to do with this? Well, you can do the usual things that people that have money do. They fund medical research. I do a lot of that. They fund educational institutions. I do a lot of that. But then something happened that, by serendipity, that made me realize how important culture was and what kind of impact you can have with a relatively small amount of dollars. And that was when I saw a chance to buy the Magna Carta. I bought it and put it on permanent display at the National Archives. And I then began buying other historic documents, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and put them on display where Americans can see them, on the theory that if they would see them, they'd be inspired to go back and learn more about the history of these documents, and if they learn more about the history, maybe they become more informed citizens, and more informed citizens might create a better democracy. And then when the Washington Monument had its earthquake problem, I said I would help fund the rehabilitation of it. Then I realized there were a number of other historic buildings that might be able to use some additional financial support, so Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, Montpelier, James Madison's home, or other things like that. And I began to realize that what I was trying to do was to enable people to learn more about their history and heritage of this country. And I coined the phrase called patriotic philanthropy, which is a little bit misleading because all philanthropy is patriotic, really. But I called it patriotic philanthropy because what I was trying to do is to say that if you have a chance to remind people of the history and heritage of their country, the culture that came before us and the culture that we have now, we might be able to produce citizens who are more informed and maybe produce a better democracy. They learn the good and the bad. So for example, when I gave money to Monticello, I said I'd love to have Monticello be a more inviting place for people to visit so they can learn more about Thomas Jefferson, but I want the slave quarters to be built out. Because I want to make sure people realize for all of his great intellectual strengths, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. The same with Montpelier. I said, happy to help rebuild Montpelier a bit, but I want the slave quarters built out so that people can see that these great men also had their flaws. They were slave owners. And by learning the good and the bad, I've tried to remind Americans of our history. And that's a very, very small part of what I do philanthropic, but the impact is significant. And this is what I mean by impact. Impact, for the dollars that I put into cultural preservation and reminding people about our culture and the various art things that I'm involved with, I have much greater impact than if I were doing the same kind of things with the same dollars in other areas. So if, for example, you are a philanthropist and you want to have impact, I think in the cultural area, with the same amount of dollars, you can have so much more impact than you were going to have with the same amount of dollars in other areas. And also in many of the other areas, while they're important, governments are often doing some of these things. Unfortunately, in the cultural area, government is giving a smaller and smaller percentage of dollars to cultural institutions. And as a result of that, if the philanthropic sector doesn't help, I don't think that these institutions will be able to preserve culture in the same way and preserve arts in the same way that will enable people to see these great things that our brain has created and inspire future generations. Final point. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he had a sentence in there that was a throwaway line. In fact, it was supposed to be relatively insignificant. The Declaration of Independence, the heart of it was intended to be the sins of King George. And that was the essence of it, and that is 80% or so of the language of the Declaration of Independence. But there was a preamble. It was thought it'd be nice to have a preamble. And so Thomas Jefferson wrote a line that became the most famous sentence in the English language, I think. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, why did that become significant? Well, he said in there, all men are created equal. Now, how could he mean that when he was there with 2 slaves, and when he was writing this, and he had about 100 slaves back at Monticello? Well, he had a concept that people were created equally, but they just perhaps couldn't live together equally. But nonetheless, that phrase became the guiding principle of our country. And through the flaws that we've had in our Constitution that allowed slavery and other things, we've had to work through this. But in the end, the guiding principle was all men are created equal, all people are created equal, and that's been the guiding principle. But the other thing that he said in there that's so significant is that what we're really about is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to me, the greatest happiness I've seen is when I see people coming to the Smithsonian, performing arts institutions, art galleries. When they leave, you see happy people. You don't see sad people leaving these kinds of institutions. And so one of the great pleasures of my life is going to see the faces of people who go to the institutions that I've been involved with, because when they leave, they're inspired to maybe learn more about what they saw in those institutions. They're happy, and happiness is a very elusive thing. Perhaps the most elusive thing among human is happiness, personal happiness. It's a very elusive thing. And when you can create happiness, which I think you do by supporting the arts and culture, I think it is, in my word, a mitzvah. That might need to be translated for some, but that means a good thing. So I just hope all of you, as you're here today and think about what we're trying to do at the Smithsonian and try to do with this discussion, remind yourself that the human brain has created incredible things. It is something that is not replicable by any other creature on the face of the earth. What we've done is we have the ability now to leave behind for future generations things that will inspire them. But to do that, we need to make certain that these organizations that do such wonderful things like the Smithsonian or the Kennedy Center or the National Gallery of Art or similar organizations around the country, I've just mentioned the ones that happen to be in Washington. These organizations create happiness. They also help perpetuate the great culture that we've been fortunate as humans to create. Thank you very much.